Hello and welcome to another edition of Canada Files. I'm Jim Deeks. Our guest on this episode is Dr. Joe MacInnis, a medical scientist whose name you may not know, but who has had as much influence on public and scientific understanding of the world's oceans as perhaps anyone in history. Collaborating with fellow pioneers like Jacques Cousteau and film producer James Cameron, Joe MacInnis's innovative work has taken him from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, to the Arctic Ocean, to the North Pole. And throughout his career, he's written several books on the subject of leadership and teamwork in such high-risk environments. And despite his recent 84th birthday, he's not slowing down one iota. Joe, I want to start our discussion somewhere near the beginning, at least of your career. And I'm intrigued by the fact that a boy who grew up in central Canada, in Ontario, roughly 1,600 miles from the nearest ocean, which would be the Atlantic, grew up to be one of the foremost experts on undersea human performance. Tell me I'm not crazy to wonder how that happened.
Well, Jim, first of all, thank you for the invitation to come and share some ideas together. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I was very lucky. I grew up in Canada, lived in Toronto, and spent summers up in the north, wilderness north of the city. And it was about that time that I discovered two master passions that have followed me ever since. A fascination with the natural world and a fascination with the human family. And of course, being young, it was the natural world that took over my young life. We lived in a place here in Ontario surrounded by thousands of lakes, and one of those lakes was where I spent summers, Balsam Lake. And I remember just looking at those, at the liquid crystal face of this lake and finding a mask and going underwater and spending time with the sunshine and the shadows and the mystery. And I remember asking a question, how deep could I go and how could I do it safely? And most importantly, what would I find if I spent time in the depths? And it's funny, looking back, that kind of master passion has followed me all through my life, and it's what gave me a kind of push towards the ocean where I asked the same questions.
Now, you went to university, obviously, after high school, and you went straight into medical school. Did your medical studies have any influence on the ultimate career choice that you decided on?
Well, the first thing to know is that I was not a good medical student. I struggled with my subjects. But the medical school gave me some really great gifts of teaching and understanding. And here it was that I could embrace my second fascination, which was the human family. And I studied physiology and pathology, and most importantly, psychology. And came away from that experience really excited about these two things, the human family and the natural world. And suddenly, being fortune's child, I guess, I came out of medical school, did my internship at just the same time that the Mercury astronauts were orbiting the Earth and Jacques Cousteau was building undersea stations, and I was able to find a way to get into that field. I met Edwin Link, who gave me a job. Ed is the father of the simulation industry, and he had an undersea project called the American Man-in-Sea Project. And Ed, bless him, gave me a Link Foundation Fellowship to study diving medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and to join his American Man-in-Sea program. And so again, fortune's child. I was very lucky in the timing.
You know, we could probably spend a couple of days talking about the many projects that you've undertaken over the last, well, I guess really almost 50 years. I think probably the easiest thing to do would be to just ask you to come up with your top 3 experiences in your career and tell us a little bit about each of them.
Well, Jim, you've just reminded me. My first deep sea expedition was in 1964 with Edwin Link, where we had two divers living in a small station on the edge of the continental shelf. And 2 years ago, 2019, I had the good fortune to join a team diving 7 miles into the Tonga Trench. And there are 55 years between those two events and some 60 deep sea science and engineering projects. I think that the three most important, I think the North Pole would be one, certainly. In 1974, sponsored by the Canadian government, I led a team, the first team of scientists to dive at the geographic North Pole. And we spent 3 days there. We made 10 dives. We had a biologist, a geologist, and we were studying the ice formations and the creatures that lived in this crystal clear water. And keep in mind that at the North Pole, every direction is south, all the time zones meet. And the sun never sets. And I can remember making the first dive, and at the end I paused. And I looked around, and as I made this kind of 360-degree slow motion spin, I imagined that I could see the Atlantic in one direction, the Pacific in another direction, and for the first time in my life, I had the sense of the global ocean as one united ocean, 140 million square miles, all of it of a piece. I think the second most significant would be perhaps Titanic. I had the good fortune to make my first dive in a French government research sub, and I can remember dropping down through the water through 4,000 meters and landing on the upper part of the ship and looking at those torn portholes, broken portholes and torn pieces of metal. Collapsed the years, and we spent 5 hours there, and so there was lots of time to think. We were taking pictures, we were collecting artifacts, but there was lots of time to think about what had happened on those decks in 1912, that kind of sociological cocktail of cowardice and chivalry and courage and panic and prayers. And of course, when you dive the Titanic, one of the questions you always ask is, what would I do? What would I do if I was on the ship and it was going down? So my third, I think, would be, not long ago I had the good fortune to be the medical advisor on Jim Cameron's 7-mile solo science dive into the Mariana Trench. And the Mariana Trench is out there in the Western Pacific, east of Japan, and it's a place of freezing cold depths and hurricane winds and ship-breaking waves. It was the toughest expedition I've ever been on. And part of that was that we lost two of our teammates in a helicopter crash early on in the expedition. And we had to overcome this and push forward in their honor, by the way. And the reason we succeeded was that we had a transformative leader. Jim inspired us. This was a guy who had invented the machine and spent 7 years of his life focused on what he believed in, which was science-driven exploration, to get us to this point. So that expedition, with Jim Cameron as our transformative leader, was an exercise, a masterclass in team genius.
You know, you mentioned Jim Cameron. Of course, he was the director of the film and creator of the film Titanic. And I'm sure with all your public speaking and seminars that you give, that people always want to talk to you about Titanic and what it was like to work with Jim Cameron. But in the totality of your career, is the work on the Titanic a truly significant achievement in your mind, or is it something that maybe was a little bit overblown or not as significant to you personally?
Yeah, Titanic certainly was a major part of my life for a few years. it conveniently was at the average depth of the ocean, which is 4,000 meters. So by focusing on the human performance and the technology at that depth, we were then accessing the abyss. But the expedition that I really enjoyed was coming away from the 1987 dive, my first dive to the Titanic, and spending 3 years building the team and the financial structure to make an IMAX film, a 90-minute IMAX film, and we did. We did 17 dives. We did the first science ever done on Titanic, and I remember inviting Jim Cameron to the world premiere in Ottawa at the Museum of Civilization, and Jim was pretty impressed, and we introduced him to the Russians, and then, as you know, he hired the Russians and went and made 12 dives to the Titanic, and that was the beginning of his blockbuster film. So it was nice to have an expedition, and then to have that expedition inspire a friend of mine to go out and make his extraordinary film, Titanic.
Speaking of expeditions, you led the team that discovered the remains of the famous British merchant ship, the Breadalbane, which sank in the Northwest Passage in 1853. And you were also co-leader of an expedition that studied the wreck of the famous Edmund Fitzgerald, the merchant ship that went down in Lake Superior in 1975. Just want to mention those two, but I want to go back to the Arctic and your work there and your development of the first subpolar research station there. Why was that so significant?
Well, her name was Sub-Igloo, and she was a transparent sphere that I designed and built here in southern Ontario, and then took up to the Arctic and used for 2 expeditions. And she was a refuge. She was a science center. She was a classroom. And the reason that she was most important to me was that she gave us time. She gave us time inside the ocean to do the science, yes, but time to reflect, time to sit inside a sphere filled with air under a fathom of ice in freezing cold water, and to think about the meaning of where we were and what it meant and the privilege of being there. So that was the significance of this small, again, the world's first manned polar station. She gave us time to think about where we were.
One of the aspects of all your work at the North Pole, of course, was diving under the polar ice cap with a former Canadian Prime Minister, the father of our current Prime Minister, and that is Pierre Trudeau.
He was a mentor to me on so many things. And he was a man who pushed his boundaries, physically and mentally. So for him to take him to a place that we had been working, most of our experiments in the polar dives were done in Resolute Bay. So to dive with Pierre at that time and to thank him for his inspiration was really a special thing for me. And you're right, I had the good fortune to take some folks under the sea and to introduce them to this majestic world. Walter Cronkite, who was doing a television series at the time, the 20th Century. I taught Walter to dive so he could lock out of a submarine. And what was impressive about that was his enthusiasm and to go through the hardship of learning to dive to get the story. This was a journalist who would do anything to get to the heart of the story. And I had the good fortune to take Prince Charles diving under the ice of the Northwest Passage. He was making a tour and wanted a kind of extra dimension to it, very interested in Arctic history and the British contribution to that history. So it was a great honor to spend 30 minutes with Prince Charles under the ice, under a fathom of ice in freezing cold water in Resolute Bay.
Joe, the United States, as well as Russia and China, have spent billions of dollars over the last, well, over 60 years, I guess, on space exploration. And I'm wondering, I know that you support the space program, and you were a very good friend, I know, of Buzz Aldrin, the famous first moon landing astronaut. But I want to ask you whether you think that many of those billions could have and should have gone to undersea exploration, to exploring our own planet and perhaps understanding the potential of our oceans more than we have.
I think this idea that money should be spent here and maybe not there is not so essential. Yeah, we could argue more money should be spent beneath the ocean. But what I see it as I said at the beginning, we stepped off this planet in two directions simultaneously. We went out into space and we went down into the ocean. And those trajectories have been in parallel ever since the 60s. And the communication back and forth between astronauts and people working under the ocean was wonderful and still is. And there is great benefit from what we learn in space through satellites that tell us about the ocean. The ocean is much better understood because of what we've done with satellites in space. So I think that the expenses are probably appropriate to the missions that was set in space, and we're headed off to Mars, landing coming up within weeks, and we're still working in the ocean. As I said, 2 years ago, I was with a team diving. They were diving 7 miles into the Tonga Trench, and in the last couple of years, all the deep trenches have been observed for the first time. So these two parallel journeys, very exciting journeys, and how lucky we are to have had a front row seat in our lifetimes of these first steps off the planet and into the ocean.
Joe, I want to get into leadership, but before we leave the deep, I do want to ask you, from all the years that you've been in and under the oceans, in all that time, did you see the effects of human activity in the water or climate change itself? What do you think is the state of the oceans today compared to when you first started diving in the 1960s?
The Mother Ocean, if she was a patient, would be in the intensive care unit. The world's largest, oldest, least understood ecosystem is under attack and has been all the time, the 50 years that I have been pursuing my interest in the sea, and I have seen the changes. They are dramatic. She's overfished, she's overheated, she's overpolluted, from microplastics to atomic waste. And in fact, my concern about this was what led to my really serious interest in leadership, because I'm not a biologist, but I know something about human performance in high-risk environments. So I thought if I could focus on leadership, I might make a contribution to the unbelievable harm that's going on inside the ocean. And so I've been focusing now for many years on what it takes, the skills and the values of good leadership that will help us bring the ocean back to some kind of normal state. And I'm fascinated with components of leadership that I call deep empathy, deep eloquence, deep endurance. Deep empathy is having a molecular sense for the people that you're working with, for the task that you're undertaking, in this case, saving the oceans, for the terrain, for the ocean itself, a molecular sense for that. And deep eloquence is being able to articulate your vision for the future of the ocean with words and actions that are accurate, brief, clear, clever. And deep endurance is having the physical and mental resilience to succeed in the mission no matter how long, difficult, or dangerous. So that's the way I'm approaching this catastrophic problem with the ocean.
One of the themes that you have been focusing on more recently is the concept of resilience. Resilience, particularly in high stress environments. That, I assume, is a subset of the leadership focus that you've concentrated on, correct?
My focus on resilience right now was accelerated by the pandemic. Realizing that in any crisis, there needs to be a way to navigate through it and to recover and to recover from the adversity. So I've been focusing on resilience, which for me has many pillars, but among them are self-care, what I call slow empathy, realistic optimism, fierce ingenuity, which is so important. And so that's where my focus has been, to try to understand how we get through this crisis and the other crises that face us, including climate change, nuclear war, cyber warfare, poverty, racism, all of these cascading simultaneously, going critical simultaneously, are going to need resilience. So that's why I'm focused on, at this moment in time, on resilience and how we can get better at it.
You know, you just mentioned a number of existential threats to mankind, not to put too fine a point on it. What is your view of the future? Because if we were talking at the outset of your career, you probably might say, well, the Cold War is a big threat, but now we've got so many other challenges that we're facing. And as you've just passed your 84th birthday, I wonder what your view is looking forward to perhaps when you and I won't be around, but is it an optimistic or is it a pessimistic view?
My current view of the future is what I would call tragic optimism. The tragic part of it comes from the size and scale of these cascading crises and what it means for my children and my grandchildren. And it breaks my heart to look at climate change and what that's going to mean for my kids and grandchildren. But I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic because there are so many beautiful minds working on these problems. From Jane Goodall to there's a long list of good scientists, and one of them is my good friend Thomas Homer Dixon, who's just written a brilliant book on all of these cascading crises. It's called Commanding Hope, and I really recommend it.
You mentioned your kids and your grandkids. Have any of your family members followed in your footsteps, or would you like to see them pursue a life or a career under the water's surface?
My greatest achievement is not in the ocean, it's not underwater, it's my family. It's my children and grandchildren, and it's not my doing. I was away climbing into submarines and diving under the ice. The reason that my family is successful is because of my wife, who took over, who was the golden anchor for all those years that I was away. So what they are, intelligent, honest, curious, is due to her. And they have that. I'm very fortunate. They are following their own passions that are artistic, creative, and contributing to society.
Joe, as someone who's literally traveled to all four corners of the earth, and more than probably any living person, spent more time under the surface of our oceans, you're still very proudly Canadian, and I just wonder what being Canadian has meant to you and means to you today.
It's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that. Being Canadian means two things for me. First, gratitude. To grow up in this splendid, luminous country with its beauty in the natural world and the beauty in its people. This is a country that gave me my education, it gave me my health, it gave me the idea of possibility. And then the second thing for me is responsibility. being Canadian means being responsible, means for the country and for the community and for the family. You could be a citizen scientist, but most importantly, you could contribute. And it was the former Prime Minister, Pierre Trudeau, who said, this country is not just governed in Ottawa, it is governed by the actions and the ideas of all of us. So this idea of responsibility has always been central to my thinking, to give back to the country in a meaningful way by making a contribution to others.
Well, Joe MacInnis, thank you so much. You've been an inspiration to at least a couple of generations of Canadians for your magnificent work under the oceans and on the subject of leadership. Thank you for joining us on Canada Files.
Thank you, Jim. Delight to be with you.
And thank you for joining us as well. We'll see you next time with more Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of the Browning Watt Foundation, as well as the following donors: Nona MacDonald Heaslip, Joe and Marie Heffernan, Michael and Mary Ellen Hogan, Donna and Richard Ivey, Alice and Ted Kernahan, Richard and Gail McGraw, the Bruce H. Mitchell Foundation, the North Pine Foundation, Eleanor and Francis Shen, the 63 Foundation, John and Margaret Deeks, Wendy Deeks, in memory of Peter A. Deeks, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.